Saturn through the signs reveals where the soul is learning maturity, responsibility, boundaries, patience, and self-mastery, and why the greatest rewards in life often arrive through time, devotion, and conscious effort rather than immediate gratification. Grand Day Soul family, and welcome back to this Lives in Astrology and another episode of the Soul of Astrology series, where we move beyond memorizing astrological keywords and instead explore each planet as a living archetype within consciousness. And today we're going to be looking at our relationship with Saturn. One relationship many astrologers describe with words like limitations, responsibility, discipline, boundaries, karma, authority, and time. Saturn, for many people, is the most misunderstood planet in astrology. Its reputation can feel quite intimidating. Some even fear Saturn because it has become associated with restriction, hardship, delays, and difficult life lessons. And while Saturn certainly represents challenge, I believe Saturn is asking a far more compassionate question. What are you willing to build? What are you willing to practice? And what are you willing to become responsible for? And who are you becoming through the choices you make every single day? Because Saturn isn't simply the planet that slows us down. She's the planet that strengthens us. She's the grandmother archetype. I don't think of Saturn as the sacred architect of the birth chart. Every great structure begins with a blueprint. Every cathedral begins with a foundation. Every magnificent tree begins with roots that no one ever sees. Saturn represents those roots. It's the invisible structure supporting everything that eventually becomes visible. Saturn is the bones beneath the body, the foundation beneath the house, the practice beneath the talent, and the commitment beneath the relationship, the discipline beneath the mastery, and the integrity beneath authentic leadership. Because without Saturn, we may have inspiration, but no follow-through. We may have vision and no structure, desire but no direction, dreams but no container capable of sustaining them. So Saturn reminds us that manifestation isn't simply about imagining the life we want, which would be very much Neptune. It's also about becoming the version of ourselves capable of holding that life once it arrives. Sometimes we ask the universe for expansion, but Saturn will gently ask, have you built the foundation to support it? We ask for abundance, but Saturn asks, can you steward it wisely? We ask for purpose, and Saturn asks, are you prepared to live it consistently? So in this way, Saturn becomes less like a cosmic disciplinarian and more like a master builder, or I call the great grandmother energy. She holds us to task. And every lesson Saturn represents is asking us to strengthen the structure beneath our lives. And astronomically, Saturn takes approximately about 29 and a half years to orbit the sun. So that means Saturn spends roughly 2.5 years moving through each zodiac sign. Unlike Mercury, Venus, or Mars, Saturn doesn't move quickly. Its pace reflects its purpose. Saturn isn't interested in temporary excitement, it's interested in lasting transformation. She understands something our modern world often forgets. Everything meaningful takes time. A relationship, a garden, a business, a craft, a body, a philosophy, a life. None of these mature overnight. Nature never rushes. The oak tree doesn't apologize for taking decades to become magnificent. The mountain isn't concerned with deadlines, and the river doesn't force itself towards the ocean. Each unfolds according to its own natural rhythm. So Saturn reminds us that consciousness develops in the exact same way. One decision, one practice, one lesson, and one season at a time. Perhaps this is why Saturn can sometimes feel uncomfortable. It refuses to skip the process. Instead, it continually asks, what are you practicing? Because eventually, practice becomes habit. Habit becomes character, and character becomes your destiny. Saturn teaches us that destiny is rarely created by one extraordinary moment. It's usually created by thousands of ordinary moments lived with intention. And one of the beautiful things about Saturn is that it allows us to observe the evolution of consciousness over time. So as Saturn moves through each sign, it invites both the collective and each of us individually to mature in a different area of life. So rather than seeing these transits as something happening to us, I like to see them as invitations to become more conscious, more responsible, more authentic, more aligned. Each Saturn transit asks a different developmental question. And as one lesson completes, another one begins. That's exactly where we are finding ourselves today. To understand Saturn's current movement through Aries, it helps to reflect on the cycle that we have just completed through Pisces. So Pisces is the final sign of the zodiac. It represents endings, completion, compassion, dreams, mysticism, imagination, faith, the unconscious. Saturn, however, represents structure, definition, boundaries, responsibility, form. And when Saturn entered Pisces, we were invited to bring structure to the intangible. How do we give form to a dream? How do we create healthy boundaries while remaining compassionate? How do we distinguish intuition from projection? And how do we embody spirituality instead of merely just talking about it? Saturn in Pisces challenged us to examine where our boundaries had dissolved, where compassion had become self-abandonment, and where faith had become fantasy, where spirituality had become a way of escaping reality instead of engaging with it more consciously. But it also offered extraordinary medicine. It reminded artists that inspiration becomes meaningful through devotion, that healers that have compassion requires healthy boundaries. It reminded spiritual seekers that wisdom must eventually become embodied. Every dream needs a container, and the vision needs practice, and that every calling eventually asks for some sort of commitment. So Saturn in Pisces quietly asked us, can you build a bridge between spirit and everyday life? And after nearly 3 years of learning that lesson, Saturn crossed over another threshold or portal moment, and not into another ending, but into a beginning. And that beginning is Aries. Saturn's movement from Pisces into Aries is one of the most fascinating transitions in the entire zodiac. Pisces is the last chapter, and Aries is the first sentence. Pisces dissolves, Aries initiates. Pisces releases, Aries begins. Pisces reminds us that every ending contains the seed of a new beginning. And Aries reminds us that every beginning requires the courage to take the first step. So in many ways, Saturn's journey through Pisces prepared us for what is now unfolding in Aries. We spent nearly 3 years learning how to surrender, how to soften and how to trust, how to grieve and how to let go of identities that could no longer support who we were becoming. Many people found themselves releasing careers, relationships, belief systems, ways of living, even versions of themselves that had quietly reached completion. That can feel uncomfortable because Saturn doesn't usually remove something until it has served its purpose. But once the foundation has become unstable, Saturn invites us to rebuild. And that is the invitation of Aries. Aries doesn't ask us to look backwards, it asks us to look forward. It says, now that you've released what no longer belongs, what would you like to create? And this is one of the reasons I find Saturn in Aries so exciting, because Aries is pure potential. It's the first breath after the exhale. It's the first sunrise after a long night. The first green shoot emerging from the soil after wintertime. It represents initiative, courage, identity, leadership, and the willingness to take action. Yet Saturn reminds us that not every beginning is meant to happen immediately. Sometimes preparation is the beginning. Sometimes saying no is the beginning. Sometimes healing is the beginning. And sometimes the bravest action we can take is choosing to build something differently than we have done before. So Saturn asks us to become intentional with our beginnings. Not because it wants us to slow down, but because it understands that what is built with awareness has a far greater chance of enduring. And as Saturn continues its journey through Aries over the next couple of years, we may find ourselves asking new questions. Who am I becoming? What am I building? What deserves my energy? What no longer deserves my energy? Where have I confused reaction with conscious action? What does authentic leadership actually look like? These are Saturn questions. Not because Saturn already has the answers, but because Saturn knows that asking better questions creates better foundations. And eventually, these foundations become our lives. So we're looking ahead to Taurus now as Saturn's going to be into Taurus in the approaching years. And one of the beautiful things about astrology is that every transit tells a larger story. No sign exists in isolation. Each prepares us for the next. And so while Aries teaches us to begin, in Taurus it teaches us to sustain. Saturn will eventually move from Aries to Taurus, beginning another chapter of collective development. So if Aries plants the seed, Taurus tends to the garden. If Aries inspires the vision, then Taurus asks whether that vision can actually support life. Taurus is concerned with value, resources, the body, food, nature, finances, security, stewardship, the physical world. So while Saturn in Aries asks, what are you courageous enough to begin? Saturn in Taurus will eventually ask, can what you begun actually endure? Can it nourish you? Can it nourish others? Can it continue growing season after season? Can your body sustain the pace you're living? Do your financial structures reflect your deepest values? Are you cultivating abundance or merely chasing it? Although Taurus still lies ahead, we can already begin sensing the bridge that Saturn is building. First we release, then we begin, and eventually we learn how to sustain. That rhythm isn't only astrology, it's life itself. Every ending, every beginning, every season of cultivation, each preparing us for the next. So now that we've explored Saturn's current journey through the zodiac, let's take an even wider view. And rather than looking at Saturn at one sign at a time, I'd like to explore Saturn through the language of the four elements, because each planet expresses itself differently depending upon the element through which it's moving. The planet doesn't change, the archetype remains the same, but the elemental language changes. Fire teaches Saturn how to direct purpose. Earth teaches Saturn how to build. Air teaches Saturn how to think collectively. And water teaches Saturn how to mature emotionally. The signs simply become different expressions of that elemental lesson. So let's look at Saturn through the fire signs: Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. Fire is the element of spirit and motion. It is inspiration, purpose, vision, courage, creativity, and the willingness to begin. So when Saturn moves through the fire signs, it asks us to become responsible for the way we use our life force. How do we direct our energy? How do we use our will? How do we express our creativity? How do we lead? How do we inspire? Fire naturally wants movement. It trusts in instinct. It follows enthusiasm. It leaps towards possibility. Saturn introduces patience here, not to extinguish the flame, but to help it burn longer. A spark can ignite something beautiful, but only a tended fire can continue offering warmth. Fire without Saturn can become impulsive. It can become stagnant. So together they teach us that courage becomes far more powerful when it is guided by wisdom. Aries expresses this lesson through courageous beginnings. Leo expresses it through authentic creative leadership. And Sagittarius expresses it through the disciplined pursuit of truth and meaning. Although each fire sign expresses Saturn differently, they all ask the same essential question: how can I use my passion in service of something that lasts? So now we have Saturn through the earth signs: Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. Earth is the element of manifestation. It governs the body, resources, health, work, stewardship, the natural world, everything that becomes tangible through time and care. Saturn feels naturally at home with the earth element. Both understand patience, consistency, responsibility, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something with integrity. When Saturn moves through the earth signs, it asks us to examine the structures we've created. Do they support life? Are they sustainable? Do they nourish our bodies? Do they reflect our deepest values? Or have we become servants to structures that no longer serve us? Taurus teaches Saturn about stability and self-worth. Virgo teaches Saturn about devotion, refinement, and meaningful service. And Capricorn teaches Saturn about leadership, responsibility, and legacy. Together, the earth signs remind us that manifestation isn't measured by speed, it's measured by sustainability. Their shared question becomes, what am I building? And will it continue to support my soul tomorrow? And then we have Saturn through the air signs: Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. Air is the element of thought, communication, perspective, ideas, relationships, and community, and all collective consciousness. So if Earth builds the structure, air gives the structure meaning. When Saturn moves through the air signs, it teaches us to become responsible for our thoughts, our words, our conversations, our agreements. and the systems we help create together. Gemini teaches Saturn to discipline the mind. Libra teaches Saturn to cultivate mature, reciprocal relationships. And Aquarius teaches Saturn to imagine structures capable of serving future generations. So together, the air signs asked us to consider what ideas deserve to become reality, what conversations create understanding or understanding, what future are we building through the way we think, communicate, and collaborate. And their shared questions become, how can my thoughts become wisdom that benefits something larger than myself? And then we have Saturn through the water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And water is the element of feeling, intuition, healing, memory, compassion, vulnerability, and the unseen emotional currents flowing beneath every human experience. Water reminds us that not everything meaningful can be measured. Some things are simply felt. So when Saturn moves through the water signs, it teaches emotional maturity, not emotional suppression, but emotional responsibility. It asks us to create healthy boundaries without closing our hearts, to honor our sensitivity without becoming overwhelmed by it, to trust our intuition while remaining grounded in reality. Cancer teaches Saturn about emotional safety and belonging. Scorpio teaches Saturn about transformation, trust, and conscious power. And Pisces teaches Saturn how to embody spirituality through everyday life. So together, the water signs remind us that wisdom isn't only intellectual, it's emotional, embodied, lived. Their shared question becomes, how can I honor the depth of my feelings while remaining anchored in my own center? So as we can see, Saturn never changes its essential nature. It will always speak the language of responsibility, integrity, boundaries, time, and mastery. But each element reveals a different classroom. Fire teaches us to master purpose. Earth teaches us to master manifestation. Air teaches us to master thought and relationship. And water teaches us to master emotional wisdom. Saturn isn't asking us to become rigid. It's asking us to become resilient. And not by resisting life, but becoming strong enough to participate in it with greater awareness. Now that we've explored Saturn through the 4 elements, let us add another layer. Because understanding or understanding a planet isn't only about the sign it's in, the house matters just as much. One of the simplest ways I've found to explain this is with a single sentence. The sign tells how the archetype expresses itself, and the house tells us where in life we're experiencing that lesson. So think of it this way. If Saturn is the teacher, the sign describes the teacher's style. The house describes the classroom. Saturn remains Saturn. It will always teach responsibility and boundaries, integrity, patience, and mastery. But each house represents a different area of life where those lessons are unfolding. So rather than walking through all 12 houses today, I'll simply offer a few examples so you can begin seeing how beautifully these pieces kind of fit together. So Saturn in the first house, for example, that's the house of identity. It represents how we meet life, our physical presence, our temperament, our sense of self, and the way we naturally move through the world. When Saturn is placed here, the lessons often revolve around becoming comfortable with your own identity, learning to trust yourself, developing confidence that isn't dependent upon outside validation. Many people with Saturn in the first house mature early. They may carry responsibility from a young age. They often feel older than their years. Life gradually teaches them that confidence isn't something they're given, it's something they cultivate. And over time, Saturn here can produce remarkable self-possession, a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it has already been earned through experience. Now, say Saturn through the 6th house, that brings Saturn into the world of daily life, your health, work, routine, habits, your service, the practices that we repeat every day. So this placement often teaches that extraordinary lives are built through ordinary moments. It reminds us that the smallest choices, repeated consistently, eventually shape the direction of our lives. Saturn here may invite us to examine our relationship with work, our relationship with the body, how we care for ourselves, how we manage our time, and whether our daily habits are actually supporting the future we're trying to create. It's a placement that reminds us that discipline isn't punishment, it's self-respect expressed through our everyday choices. Now, Saturn in the 9th house, for example, well, that expends our attention towards meaning. It governs philosophy, higher education, travel, spirituality, belief systems, and our search for truth. So when Saturn moves into this house, life often invites us to examine what we truly believe. Not simply what we've been taught, and not merely what we've inherited, but what we've personally tested through lived experience. This placement often asks us to become students before becoming teachers, to embody wisdom before attempting to share it, because Saturn reminds us that information is plentiful, but wisdom is earned. And perhaps that's one of Saturn's greatest gifts. It teaches us to slow down enough that understanding has time to mature. These are only 3 examples, because every house represents another classroom, another arena of experience, another opportunity to develop consciousness. But when we begin combining the planet, the sign, the element, the house, and eventually the aspects, the birth chart starts transforming from something we memorize into something we experience. It becomes less about prediction and more about participation, less about fate and more about conscious relationship. And for me, that's where astrology truly comes alive. It just stops being a collection of symbols themselves and begins revealing itself as a living conversation between the soul and life itself. And the medicine of Saturn? Well, why does it ask so much of us? Why does it seem to slow us down, to challenge us, to ask us to practice, to wait, to build, and to begin again? I don't believe Saturn is interested in making life more difficult. No, I believe Saturn is interested in making us more capable. Every healthy boundary strengthens us. Every promise we keep to ourselves strengthens us. Every time we choose integrity over immediate gratification, Saturn quietly smiles, because confidence rarely arrives before action. More often, confidence is what grows after we've shown up again and again and again. Saturn reminds us that mastery is never an event. It's a relationship with practice, with patience, and with becoming. And perhaps that's why Saturn has become one of my favorite archetypes, because beneath all its lessons, its boundaries, its responsibilities, Saturn is really teaching one thing: self-respect. And not the kind that comes from achievement or recognition or status, but the kind that's built quietly through thousands of small choices, made with integrity. And that kind of self-respect no one can ever take away. We've got this, Soul Fam. So much love.